In Joshua 4, the Israelites had just crossed over the Jordan River on dry ground, and they were getting ready to conquer the Promised Land. But before they did that, they paused to set up a memorial of stones so that they could remember what God had done for them. So in this Bible study, we'll look at the memorials that they built and what practical lessons we can take away from this story. Hi, my name is David Cipriano. I am a youth pastor, and here in this channel, we're currently going through a series going through the book of Joshua. We're going through this book chapter by chapter, verse by verse. So far, we've been doing one chapter per episode. And so here's some context for the book of Joshua before we get into today's story. You see, Israel had just spent 40 years wandering in the wilderness, and Moses, their former leader, had just died. And now God has called Joshua to be their new leader and to take over the Promised Land. So back in chapter 1, we saw God's call to Joshua. In chapter 2, we saw the story of Rahab and how God uses a prostitute to protect and save his people. In the last episode, we looked at chapter 3, where the Israelites crossed the Jordan River. It's a story about faith, about their obedience to God, and the miracle that God does for them. And then now we're in chapter 4, where we're looking at the story of the memorial stones, where the people are remembering what God has done. So let's read the first 7 verses here of Joshua chapter 4. And it came to pass, when all the people were clean passed over Jordan, that the Lord spake unto Joshua, saying, Take you 12 men out of the people, out of every tribe of man, and command ye them, saying, Take you hence out of the midst of Jordan, out of the place where the priest's feet stood firm, 12 stones, and ye shall carry them over with you, and leave them in the lodging place where ye shall lodge this night. Then Joshua called the 12 men whom he had prepared of the children of Israel out of every tribe of man. And Joshua said unto them, Pass over before the ark of the Lord your God into the midst of Jordan, and take you up every man of you a stone upon his shoulder, according unto the number of the tribes of the children of Israel. That this may be a sign among you, that when your children ask their fathers in time to come, saying, What mean ye by these stones? Then ye shall answer them, that the waters of Jordan were cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. When it passed over Jordan, the waters of Jordan were cut off, and these stones shall be for a memorial unto the children of Israel forever. Never forget what God has done for you. So as I'm recording this, last week, Americans celebrated Memorial Day. This is an annual holiday where we honor and remember the military members who died in service to our country. We remember how they paid the ultimate price for our freedom. We remember how they protected our nation and gave the ultimate sacrifice, sacrificing their lives for ours. We look up to them as a model of courage, duty, and patriotism. We remember with sadness how for every fallen soldier, there's a hurting family who misses them. And so Memorial Day is really an attempt to preserve their legacy. And I think that holidays like Memorial Day, Veterans Day, the 4th of July, these are really important dates so that we don't forget to remember. You know, in Joshua chapter 4, the people of Israel also had a Memorial Day. This was a time when they set up memorials so that they could remember what God had done for them. So they had just crossed the Jordan River into the Promised Land, and God had done a miracle for them. This miracle was to be a sign of his presence among them. It was a mark of God's power, and this was going to give them faith for the future. But before they move on and really conquer the Promised Land, they set up 2 memorials so that they can remember what God has done. Because people are likely to forget things. That's just our nature as humans. And especially whenever it comes to God, we often take things for granted. We forget the place that we were in. And so it's so important that, like the Israelites, we set up memorials in our life. So as we look at chapter 4, I want to see 2 main things. First of all is the memorial that Israel made. And there's 3 different ways that we can describe this memorial. First of all, it was a memorial of what God had done. Here's what the Bible says, starting in verse 4. Then Joshua called the 12 men whom he had prepared of the children of Israel out of every tribe a man. And Joshua said unto them, Pass over before the ark of the Lord your God unto the midst of Jordan, and take you up every man of you a stone upon his shoulder, according unto the number of the tribes of the children of Israel. That this may be a sign among you, that when your children ask their fathers in time to come, saying, What mean ye by these stones? Then ye shall answer them, that the waters of Jordan were cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord, when it passed over Jordan. The waters of Jordan were cut off, and these stones shall be for a memorial unto the children of Israel forever. And the children of Israel did so as Joshua commanded, and took up 12 stones out of the midst of Jordan, as the Lord spake unto Joshua, according to the number of the tribes of the children of Israel, and carried them over with them unto the place where they lodged, and laid them down there. This stack of stones was a memorial of what God had done. Whenever people go on vacation, they often like to get souvenirs from their trips. They might get a magnet, they might get a t-shirt, they might get a coffee cup, they might take pictures or post about it on social media. And these types of things really help people to remember the good times that they had. And in this Bible story, the memorial that Israel makes is kind of like a souvenir, because it's a visual reminder of something that happened. You see, the people had just witnessed a miracle. It was the most amazing thing that they'd ever seen in their lives. I mean, the Jordan River stopped, the flow was cut off, and an estimated 2 million people walked over on dry ground. Now, as unforgettable as this would be, God knew that people were prone to forget it. And so these memorial stones that God tells them to build would be a reminder to them. Because it's our human nature to be forgetful, we often take things for granted, and sometimes we forget the miracles that God has done in our lives. Hey, that's why we have to work at remembering. And this is something that the children of Israel had been warned about before, because in Deuteronomy chapter 8, the people were told to remember what God had done for them these 40 years in the wilderness. Let's read those verses, Deuteronomy 8, starting in verse 11. It says, Beware that thou forget not the Lord thy God, in not keeping his commandments and his judgments and his statutes, which I command thee this day, lest when thou hast eaten and art full, and hast built goodly houses and dwelt therein, and when thy herds and thy flocks multiply, and thy silver and thy gold is multiplied, and all that thou hast is multiplied, then thine heart be lifted up, and thou forget the Lord thy God, which brought thee forth out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage. Now God had done so many great things for Israel, he had performed so many miracles for them, and yet the people often forgot about it. People started to think that the things that were going good for them were of their own doing. People started to not recognize their need for God, and they started to live lives without him. God knows this, and so God is warning them to not forget. And you know, we today might look at the Bible and think, shame on the Israelites. How could they possibly forget the miracles God did? But how often are we the same way? Because it's easy to forget God's works. It's easy to take them for granted. And I think that this is a good reason for us to have personal monuments in our lives. No, it doesn't have to be a building. It doesn't have to be a statue. It doesn't have to be stones stacked on top of each other. It doesn't have to be anything big or super special, but it's good to have something to remind you of what God has done in your life. Hey, maybe for you, a good way to remember what God's done is to journal. Whenever God does something great in your life, you write it down. I've seen people who would have prayer list buckets where they would have in one bucket things that they're praying for, and then eventually when God answers that prayer, they put it in the answered prayer bucket. Some people, whenever God really works in their life, they post about it as not only a way of telling the world, but reminding their future self of what happened. Some people are really into art and they can communicate truths to themselves that way. And so there's lots of ways to make personal monuments, lots of good ways to remind yourself of what God has done. I would just encourage you to do what's best for you. You know, whenever we look at what the Israelites make here and what God had commanded them to do, God's design for a monument was very simple. It was just simply stones stacked on top of each other. I mean, God was not concerned about being impressive or being beautiful or elaborate. This was really just a simple thing. I mean, they're not building a cathedral or some crazy temple. They're really just taking the stones that already exist and then making a formation out of them. And I think that there's a takeaway that we should get from this, because so often we think that what we're doing isn't enough, and yet it's exactly what God has commanded us to do. Hey, maybe you're listening to this and you feel like you're not doing enough for God, and yet you're doing exactly what God wants. Maybe you're thinking to yourself, all I'm doing for God is praying. All I'm doing for God is just reading my Bible. Maybe you think all I do is show up to church. All I do is be faithful. Maybe you have a ministry that you're signed up for your church, and maybe you feel like it's not significant enough or meaningful enough. Maybe you're telling yourself, all I'm doing is serving the coffee. All I'm doing is helping kids behave in a class. All I'm doing is helping people park their cars in the parking lot. Hey, this is a common attack of the enemy, that we're not doing enough. And I just want to remind you today that maybe the thing that you're doing for God isn't flashy, maybe it's not miraculous, but that can be exactly the thing that God wants. We look at the story of Israel building the stones, and they build them the way that God had told them to. And from a human standpoint, this memorial wasn't really anything special. It wasn't anything out of the ordinary, but really there's beauty in simple obedience. There's beauty in the routine, in the ordinary. Sometimes the thing that God tells us to do is simple, and that makes us want to reject it or think that it's not meaningful enough, but in reality, it's what God wants. So we see that this memorial was a memorial of what God had done. Second, it was a monument for future generations. Here's what Joshua says in verses 6 and 7, and this is kind of the main purpose for building this memorial. He says, that this may be a sign among you, that when your children ask their fathers in time to come, saying, what mean ye by these stones? Then ye shall answer them, that the waters of Jordan were cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord, when it passed over Jordan. The waters of Jordan were cut off, and these stones shall be for a memorial unto the children of Israel forever. So the people were to make this monument of stones, and eventually future generations would see this. And they would notice how strange and kind of out of place it was, and people would be asking questions. And whenever people would ask the questions, then that would give the Israelites, this first generation, to remind them that God had helped them cross over the Jordan on dry ground. This would really be a teaching opportunity. You see, there's an emphasis here on telling others about what God has done. This is a really important practice, and I think that we should do the same thing in our lives. Whenever God does something for us, it's good to let others know. It's good to share a testimony. Maybe it's about answered prayer. Maybe God has delivered you from some sin. Maybe God has given you healing. Maybe He's helped you to overcome a struggle that you've had. Maybe God has given you an opportunity, or maybe He's giving you peace about a situation. When God does these things, it's good to let others know. And that's what the Israelites are doing. God had helped them cross the Jordan River, and so they build this memorial of stones so that one day people would ask about it and they could tell them about the miracle that God did. Psalm 103 says, bless the Lord, O my soul, and all that is within me, bless His holy name. Bless the Lord, O my soul, and forget not all His benefits. And that last phrase there is so important, forget not all His benefits. You know, I think that one of the ways for us to not forget what God has done is to tell it to others. And as the Israelites seek to tell others about what God has done for them, there is a special emphasis on the next generation. And hey, just bluntly speaking, this next generation needs us Christians. And this is one of the reasons why I'm a youth pastor, because I have a burden for the next generation of people. I see that these people are at an influential age right now. I see that they need mentorship and discipleship, and sadly, they're not getting enough of it. I see so many young adults leaving the faith. And that's why it's so important for us as Christian adults to invest in the next generation, because they're going to need God. They need to know what God has done for us. They need to know how God has worked in your life. And so when the Israelites are commanded to build this monument, it's not just for them, it's for the next generation. The third thing that we see is that this memorial was a message to the world. If we go to the end of the chapter, it says, starting in verse 21, "And he spake unto the children of Israel, saying, When your children shall ask their fathers in time to come, saying, What mean these stones? Then ye shall let your children know, saying, Israel came over this Jordan on dry land. For the Lord your God dried up the waters of Jordan from before you, until ye were passed over, as the Lord your God did to the Red Sea, which he dried up from before us, until we were gone over. That all the people of the earth might know the hand of the Lord, that it is mighty, that ye might fear the Lord your God forever." So this memorial of stones wasn't just for themselves, it wasn't just for their children, it was for the entire world. Joshua said that all the people of the earth might know. The Israelites were told to tell everybody about what God had done. And I think that likewise we should also be telling the world what God has done for us, whether that's healing, whether it's provision in an unexpected way, whether God has given you success. We should be giving God the credit for everything that he does. And you know what? The most important thing that we should be telling other people about is our salvation. We ought to tell people how God has saved us from sin and how he's transformed our lives. Jesus said in Mark 16:15, "Go ye into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature." Paul said it in Romans 1:16, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believeth, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek." Hey, if you are saved, if God has saved your life from sin, and if he's given you eternal life, you ought to be telling people. Hey, it's a shame how many Christians there are who have never shared their faith. I mean, they're saved, they're given a home in heaven, and yet they seem to have no desire for letting other people know the good news. It's like they don't care about people spending an eternity in hell. And what a shame that is. We ought to be telling everybody that we can that Jesus saves. I mean, we're all sinners. We've done wrong, said wrong, thought wrong. And so Jesus Christ came to save us from our sins. He died on a cross, was buried in the grave, and he rose again to give us new life. And for us to be saved, we have to place our faith in him. That's the message that we need to be telling the world. You know, whenever something really exciting happens, you want to tell everyone. And that's how the Israelites felt about the crossing of the Jordan River, because this was the craziest thing that they'd ever seen in their lives, and so they have to tell people. They make this monument of stones so that one day they'll have the opportunity to tell people about it, not just for the original witnesses, not just for those people's children, but that all the world might know. You see, God had performed a miracle that was worth remembering. God did something that was worth telling people about. God gave them a reason to have faith and for people to become believers. So we see the memorial that Israel made, and then second, we see the memorial Joshua made. We read about this in verse 9. It says, "And Joshua set up 12 stones in the midst of Jordan, in the place where the feet of the priests which bear the ark of the covenant stood, and they are there unto this day." Now, something that many people don't realize and haven't noticed yet is that in Joshua 4, there's actually two memorials made, not just one. You see, there's the main one that we just talked about, where the leaders of the 12 tribes of Israel all did it together, and they build this public memorial on the land. But then there's also another memorial that only Joshua did, and this was a separate memorial in the river. And so I want to share with you 3 details about that memorial. The first one is that it was unaccompanied. We see this in verses 8 and 9. It says, "And the children of Israel did so as Joshua commanded, and took up 12 stones out of the midst of Jordan, as the Lord spake unto Joshua, according to the number of the tribes of the children of Israel, and carried them over with them unto the place where they lodged, and laid them down there." So that's the main one. That's the public memorial that all Israel takes a part in. And then in verse 9, there's Joshua's personal memorial. It says, "And Joshua set up 12 stones in the midst of Jordan, in the place where the feet of the priests which bear the ark of the covenant stood, and they are there unto this day." So the first memorial was made by Israel, where each tribe had a representative, but then the second one was made by Joshua alone, and it was personal to him. Now, to make some personal application here, just getting really practical now, do you have your own faith? Is it really personal to you, or is it just somebody else's? Because we see on one hand, the leaders of the 12 tribes all took part in this one memorial whenever they were commanded to, but then Joshua also built his own personal memorial that wasn't commanded. And this was proof that Joshua's faith, his relationship with God, was personal to him. It wasn't just something that he was made to do. You know, I think that this is one of the big problems in the church today. It's one of our biggest issues in Christianity, and it's that people don't really have their own faith. Their faith isn't really personal to them. They're just sort of blindly following somebody else. And as a youth pastor, this is really one of my biggest burdens. It's my desire that the teenagers in my youth group don't just copy their parents' faith, that they don't just go along with peer pressure and just do whatever the crowd says, but that they truly have a personal relationship with God. Because so many teenagers in church don't have their own faith. And this is evidenced by a few statistics. One is that 2 out of every 3 high schoolers in church will stop attending church by the ages of 18 to 22. I mean, just think about that in an average youth group, a majority of the people won't be in church at all in just a couple of years. Statistics tell us that in the last 50 years, the number of non-religious young adults in America has more than quadrupled. And hey, let me just tell everybody listening to this that if your faith doesn't become personal to you, then you will end up on the wrong side of these statistics. Last week, whenever I was teaching the youth group, I told the teenagers that right now, whether or not they come to church probably isn't their personal decision. But you know what? One day, it's going to be. There will be a time when the teenagers become adults and mom and dad can't make them go to church anymore. They can't make them have a relationship with God, and they can't make them do right. And that's one of the reasons why it's so important that we get people grounded in their faith whenever they're young. It's important that they start following Jesus personally right now, because they're going to have to one day decide for themselves that God is personal to them. And really, this isn't just a problem for teenagers. This is a common problem for adults as well, because peer pressure doesn't end at a certain age. And I see so many adults who really don't know what they believe. If you were to ask them difficult questions about Christianity, they couldn't give a good answer. They couldn't really give you a good reasons for why they believe what they believe. And so we have to make our faith personal to us. And that's what Joshua had done. Joshua had made the decision that following God was personal to him. He's not just doing what everybody else does. He's not just doing whatever Moses told him to do. He's not just doing what his parents told him to do or what the culture is doing. No, he's serving God on his own, all by himself, without any obligation. So just like Joshua, we need to make our faith personal to us. So Joshua built this memorial unaccompanied. Second thing that we see is that it was uncommanded. You see, for Israel's public memorial, it was commanded from God to Joshua, to the people. But then for Joshua's personal memorial, we don't see God commanding it anywhere. Not to say that Joshua's memorial was disobedience, but rather that it was voluntary. He's doing it not because he has to, but because he wants to. You know, it's one thing if we obey God whenever God commands something explicitly, but it's really another level whenever we do something for God without being commanded. That's going the extra mile. It's when we do something not out of obligation, but out of love. You know, Jesus really gave this principle in the Sermon on the Mount whenever he said that whenever somebody commands you to go a mile with them and to carry their pack, you should go too. Jesus commanded the extra mile, and we should apply this principle to all sorts of areas in our lives. That's what Joshua's doing. Because for one, he's doing what's commanded and having the leaders of the tribes of Israel build the public memorial, but then he does something additionally. He does a bonus project, which is building a memorial by himself. So this was unaccompanied, it was uncommanded, and then finally it was unseen. You see, Israel's memorial was a permanent monument for future generations, but then Joshua's memorial was either never seen again, or it was barely seen again. And here's why I say this. You see, in verse 9 it says, "And Joshua set up 12 stones in the midst of Jordan, in the place where the feet of the priests which bear the ark of the covenant stood, and they are there unto this day." And then if we skip ahead to verses 17 and 18, it says, "Joshua therefore commanded the priests, saying, Come ye up out of Jordan. And it came to pass, when the priests that bear the ark of the covenant of the Lord were come up out of the midst of Jordan, and the soles of the priests' feet were lifted up unto the dry land, that the waters of Jordan returned unto their place, and flowed over all his banks, as they did before." So while the people of Israel were crossing over the Jordan, those priests that were holding the ark were standing in the middle where the water had been, and Joshua ends up putting his memorial where the priests' feet were. Well, after the priests came out of the water eventually returned, and it was no longer dry ground, thus meaning that Joshua's memorial was covered by water. You see, Israel's memorial was visible, it was noticeable, it was very public, a monument to future generations, but then Joshua's personal memorial was in the middle of the river covered by water, not too visible at all if it was visible. And this means that Joshua, in a way, is doing it for himself. So he wasn't just doing it for the attention, not for the applause of men, not to try to build his own legacy. It's rather a personal act between him and God. Now, people would have seen him building it, but then people wouldn't have really seen it afterwards. You know, maybe somebody listening to this has been doing a work that no one sees. Hey, maybe you've been doing your devotions at home in private. Maybe you've been worshiping God by yourself without anybody else around. Maybe you've been faithful to the thing that God has called you to, and yet no one's noticed. Maybe you've been generously giving to God and to God's work, but nobody's ever praised you for it. Maybe you feel unnoticed, discouraged, and nobody's praised you for the good things that you've been doing. Hey, people may not see it, but God sees it, and that's really all that matters. I mean, think about Joshua's memorial, because as soon as the river returns to its normal place, then nobody really sees what he did. That might have made him feel like it wasn't worthwhile, but really he's doing it for God. He's not doing it for people. He's doing it as an act of worship to the Lord. Whenever Michelangelo worked on the Sistine Chapel, he spent years and years painting the ceiling. He often laid on his back. He often craned his neck in an uncomfortable position for hours at a time. Michelangelo put such intricate detail into the corners and crevices of a ceiling in places where few people would ever see or notice it. And to a lot of people, this seemed like a waste of time. I mean, he's causing a lot of physical pain to his body working on things that nobody's really going to see. And so eventually somebody asked him why he was doing all of this. Why are you putting so much detail into things that nobody will see? And his response was this: God will see it. You see, in Colossians 3, it says, "And whatsoever ye do, do it heartily, as to the Lord and not unto men, knowing that of the Lord ye shall receive the reward of the inheritance, for ye serve the Lord Christ." Hey, this is a powerful reminder to us that whenever we serve God, we're serving God. We're not doing it for people. And maybe you're at a place in your life where you feel unnoticed. Maybe you feel like you've been wasting your time. Maybe you think that nobody sees you. But hey, if you're doing it for God, then you can trust that God sees it. God knows what you're doing, and you need to remember that whenever things get lonely, things get tough, you're doing it for the praise of God, not for the praise of people. I remember being at a church and hearing that the song leader had a hard time getting people to sing specials on Sunday night or Wednesday night. Like, he could get people to sing a solo in church on a Sunday morning, but whenever he asked for Sunday night or Wednesday night services, people would tell him no, and the reason would be that not enough people would be there to listen to it. I mean, that is such a shame. Because when a person has this kind of an attitude, it shows that they're not singing for God, they're singing for themselves. Hey, if you won't do something because of the lack of a crowd, then you need to seriously evaluate here who's being worshipped. Like, do you sincerely want for God to be worshipped, or do you want for you to be worshipped? If you won't do it in front of a small crowd because you won't get enough attention, then you aren't really qualified to do it in front of a big crowd because you're doing it for the wrong reason. And I think about how Joshua builds this memorial. He does it in a place where he knows that people won't be able to see it in the future, but that's okay because he's not doing it for people, he's doing it for God. You see, his act of worship isn't for attention. It's not him trying to be memorable or trying to just put on a spectacle. No, it's an act of worship between him and God. It was unaccompanied, it was uncommanded, it was unseen. And I think that this is one of the greatest things that Joshua does, because it reveals that his faith is personal to him. This was a self-initiated thing that he wasn't commanded or forced to do. This was an act of sincerity, and it was for God, not for people. So as we wrap up this Bible study about memorials, here's 3 things that we should remember about them. The first is that memorials remind us of what God has done. That's why the Israelites built their stack of stones, because they wanted for them to remember, and they wanted for future generations to know that God had performed a miracle for them. And it's good for us to set up memorials in our lives so that we don't forget what God's done. Next, memorials give us opportunities to tell others about God. You see, whenever they built this monument of stones, it was so that other people in the future one day would ask them questions about it so that they could have an opportunity to teach them about God's works. And that's a good function of memorials in our lives. It gives us opportunities to testify about God's goodness. And then the third truth about memorials, and we especially see this in the memorial of Joshua, is that memorials are primarily for God, not for other people. And so I just want to leave you with this encouragement to set up some memorials in your life, because they will help you remember what God's done for you, and they're going to give you opportunities to tell others about Christ. Well, I hope that this Bible study was a help to you. If it was, then consider doing me a favor by clicking the like button so that the platform will push this content to more people. Make sure to subscribe so that you don't miss out on future episodes. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode.